Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
While that's happening, Ireland, is your last speaker back from the bathroom? Yep, okay. We'll get started with verbal introductions as well while we wait for the text ones to come in. So my name is Rob. I'll be chairing the panel today from Australia. I'll let the rest of the panel introduce themselves, please.
Hi, I'm Andrew, England.
Hi, I'm Daisy from China.
Hi, I'm Etta from Croatia.
Hi everyone, Francois from South Africa.
All right, and then I think that is everyone. So let's us now go through the team, starting with proposition, who should be Ireland today.
Pakistan is proposition, Ireland is opposition.
My apologies, that is good to know. All right, so would Pakistan like to introduce themselves, please?
Yeah, my name is Raheem. I'm the first speaker of the proposition for the Pakistan team.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shajil. I'm the second speaker for proposition, and I'll be giving reply as well.
Thank you.
My name is Rafet Abbasum. I'll be the third speaker of proposition.
Thank you. And we'll get the opposition team name as well now, please.
My name is Jack, and I will be speaking first and giving a reply.
Thank you.
Yeah, also Jack P. I'll be speaking second.
Thank you.
Matt Mallon, speaking third.
Fantastic. All right, just give me one more second to put all these names on the ballot, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and congratulations on making it to the Octofinals of online WSDC. It's a fantastic achievement, so a round of applause before we start for that. Today's debate will function just like the rest of the debates. As far as I'm aware, the rules of World Schools haven't changed overnight, so speeches will be up to 8 minutes long, offer POIs between the 1st and 7th minute. I will try and make hand signals at the appropriate times, but I'm bad at counting and bad at doing that, so also please time yourselves and time other speakers. If you have a strong preference for how you'd like POIs to be offered to you, please indicate that at the start of your speech. Otherwise, if there are no questions then, on the motion, this House believes that social movements should actively use anger to mobilize support for their cause. I'd like to invite the first speaker proposition to begin the debate. Here.
Okay, I will assume that I am audible, and I prefer my POIs verbally, not in chat. Cool. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The words, "I can't breathe," resonated across the world. The outrage that it caused, the impassioned speeches, the vigor and heart of the protesters, we think was enough to shake the foundations of the American judicial system. You got accountability for the vile acts committed on Black men. You got the defunding of a historically and presently oppressive and corrupt police system. We think this impact only came about because people were outraged and people cared enough to consistently protest and to join up with the social movement. We think in that case, we think it is a fundamental good that social movements mobilize anger in order to get this support. Two arguments then. Firstly, why do we think anger is fundamentally empowering and so social movements should represent the will of their community members? And secondly, how do we mobilize consistent and greater amounts of support? The iron point here is that we gain more support, but not just in quantity, but also quality in terms of the dedication that our protesters show. What do we mean by actively using anger? Firstly, on rhetoric, you focus on things like injustice or mass trauma or how the system is extremely oppressive. Secondly, during protests, the way that you chant. We think the messaging of the protest fundamentally changed. It's not please help us. It is you are going to help us because you have historically committed so many wrongs against us that need to be rectified. We think one thing we want to establish right off the bat, we don't think there's a clear and direct correlation between anger and violence. We think it's unreasonable for an opposition to claim so. What do we think anger looks like? One, we think it's a unique emotion. It's something that everybody can relate to on some level. Secondly, we think it's induced easily because, there's a lot of injustice to go around within today's world. And we think the problem is that you have things like extreme apathy. One, it's caused by helplessness. And two, not all forms of oppression are visible. So you need some sort of strong moral intuition to grab people in on these sorts of issues. We think anger acts as an extreme motivating factor, both mental and physical. And fourthly, we think the response to anger is different per individual.
Question?
Not yet. It's not just physical. It's things like funding, the way that how vocal you are in support for your protest. We don't think these are going to devolve into these violent riots because there are things like self-interest that's still acting. One, we think ideological leanings. You're not just going to go out and attack innocents. And two, you want to benefit the movement. In the instance in which violence doesn't, we don't think people are going to use it. What is our principle? One, historical context. We think oppression in all forms has done one thing. It has made the oppressed silent and submissive. For women, it's that they should stay at home and just be quiet. It's for Black people, they just have to accept that the white man is better. And the sheer scale of oppression that we see, from slavery to Jim Crow to police brutality, we think that is the world we're living in, the world where protests like Black Lives Matter are essential. But secondly, how do we think anger empowers you? One, we think it generates that physical enticement. But secondly, it makes you feel extremely powerful, that you need to fight against the system, that this system is fundamentally unfair and you should not accept it. And thirdly, we think it directs the negative emotions to the oppressor. Two principles then. One, we think we gain power, not right now, in a reparative sense, because you're having your voice heard. We think you are stripped of that as an oppressed group. We think now you end up reclaiming it. We think that is an independent principle that they have to deal with. But secondly, on the duty to members, we think social movements are outlets for an oppressed community that reflect the wider sentiments of that populace. And we think these groups are furious at the inaction, at the tokenistic incremental reforms, and at the active oppression that they've had to face within their given situations. We think social movements have a duty to reflect that. It's the job of them to do so. That established practical outcomes. What do we think anger uniquely does? One, it allows you to overcome barriers, things like social exclusion, things like fear, things like inhibition. Because during protests or social movements, there is a likely threat against you from, let's say, government forces. We think anger allows you to overcome that barrier because of the strong emotive response. Secondly, we think it pushes individuals in a variety of ways, in terms of their donations, in terms of their vocal support, in terms of their consistency at showing up at protests. And thirdly, as I've already talked about, it's fundamentally empowering. We think anger combined with self-interest means that people are going to use it in the optimum way. We think when you had, for example, Black Lives Matter has done protests for the past 4 years, but they have not been effective at generating any change. But with the slogan of "I can't breathe," with the spreading of George Floyd's murder, and the outrage that it showed in the protests and in the response to it, we think that rage and injustice is the strongest tactic that you have. Before I go on. Yeah.
Team Pakistan say that anger is not associated with violence. I don't think you have a patent on an emotion, so you can't really define it. But what emotion is violence associated with, if not anger?
One, we think that it is not the only response to anger. We'll show you why necessarily even violence within certain instances can also be productive. Impacts, we think that was pretty relevant. Hardcore activists, we think they are going to support the movement on both sides, but we think they do so even more in our world. We think now, because you galvanize them, you play up their emotions about the injustice. Now they go on even longer during protests. They increase the loudness of their chants at protests. They increase the donations and outreach that they do. We think hardcore activists are just pushed even more to benefit the movement. Secondly, softer activists who don't do more than, let's say, protest once or twice. We think the scale of change that we get with these people is much greater because of the emotive push, because they're not scared to, let's say, back down when faced with a police response. We think that they're now able to more effectively mobilize. These are people on the ground who now get even better grassroots change. But thirdly, normal people, normal supporters of the movement. We think one of the problems is performative activism, where they feel like just putting up a post on social media is enough. We think we take that away because we give them a greater moral intuition, a greater emotive response for them to do even more for the movement. We think this encompasses the vast majority of people. Black Lives Matter has a lot of support right now, but we think that support can be galvanized even better in our world. And let's talk to you about violence. We think there may be a little bit of a threat of increase of violence. But firstly, we think it's the oppressors who do so. In the Black Lives Matter protest, it wasn't the protesters who were violent, it was the police response. We think the benefits of that then is one, you can use it to generate even further moral panic or even further outrage, only increasing support for your movement. So even in the instance that violence breaks out, we're perfectly fine with it. Fourthly, moderates or people who are apathetic. One, the sheer scale of support and the galvanization that we get on our side, we think is going to push a lot of people who were previously apathetic towards us. Secondly, relatability and emotion. Right now, they don't know why they should care. Like calm appeals to rationality just don't work. We think you override you override that response in the instance in which anger becomes the primary directive. And fifthly, on extremists, we think now you don't back down from their challenges. You more actively engage them on platforms like social media, as opposed to trying to convince them. We think that in that instance, we better deal with extremists on our side. But even if we don't get the quantity of support, we get consistency and we get quality. The protests themselves are much more impactful, much more consistent. And the impacts then, one, mass mobilization, and two, consistent pressure, means the initial change the movement wanted is going to get achieved. But the unique benefit that we have is you get even more change than you initially asked for. If Black Lives Matter had just settled for, let's say, accountability, you wouldn't have had things like Breonna's Law come about. So because we think the anger is justified and the social movements necessarily have to represent it, and because we think we get so much more support that they simply cannot mobilize because anger is a unique emotion, we think Pakistan very clearly should win this debate.
Next, here.
Can I be heard?
Cool. Volume on camera.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, the camera isn't on actually. On an emotion. This debate is not about what they define anger as being. This debate is about how people react to angry rhetoric. That is what actually matters in this discussion. Most of the rebuttal will be integrated, but first, let's take their principle out of the debate. Two things in their principle. Firstly, anger and righting historical wrongs. Firstly, they claim that this thing is independent. I don't think this principle is independent in any way whatsoever. Because for a principle to be about righting historical wrongs, you have to in some way allow for those historical wrongs to be righted. So until they prove to us that they right historical wrongs, which I'm going to disprove, this principle really isn't in the debate. Their second principle then on reflecting these people. Firstly, you cannot assert that everyone who is within a social movement is angry. If that principle was true, secondly, all social movements would be angry. Do you think all Black Lives Matter movements, all LGBT rights movements are actually angry? For that principle to be true, that has to be true. I don't think that is. Finally, on Black Lives Matter. Panel, I don't think the arrest of George Floyd's murderers is systematic change. They never addressed that. I don't think that is an example for our side, for their side. What is our counterfactual? Panel, don't let Pakistan conflate anger with upset. We are totally fine with upset. The difference between these two sides is that we are the MLK, they are the Black Panthers. We are the ANC after Mandela's arrest, they are the ANC before. We are the civil rights movements in Ireland, they are Sinn Féin and the IRA. We are not calling them terrorists, we are not calling them movements of violence, but ultimately the movements that they have to defend are the movements with the angry rhetoric. They are the movements that are diametrically opposed to the status quo. Ours are the movements that instead want to be constructive and want to be inclusive of everyone in society. Who wins this debate? The team that gets more change, but crucially, something Pakistan never dealt with, the team that gets better change and better outcomes. That's something they didn't deal with properly. Firstly, why do we think they don't get change on their side of the house? You have to understand that movements have extremely limited political capital. As a minority, you've got very little political capital. They rely on moderates, the support of moderates entirely to achieve anything, something Pakistan addressed on their 7 minutes. Two trusts to this point. Even if they don't create violence, they get no change. Secondly, why they probably create violence and don't get any change as a result. Firstly, even if they don't create violence, why don't they get change? 2 reasons. Discourse. What does this discourse that is created by an angry movement actually look like? I'm going to contrast this with what Pakistan's did. I think ours is significantly more realistic. It looks like you're lecturing the people who have oppressed you, the people who have benefited from your oppression, the people whose parents, whose grandparents were slave owners, rather than teaching them a lesson. You are angry at them. Blame these things on those people. And that is because anger has to be directed at someone. Someone has to be blamed for what that anger is. That is something they don't contend with. But crucially, panel, because anger is the language of the past, because anger is the language of blame, you're constantly situated on the past. You are not situated on what the future could look like if your social movement succeeds. You're entirely situated on blaming those who oppressed you in the past. Crucially then, what that does is it distances moderates. And I think it is very regrettable that a minority has to be palatable for them to be accepted by moderates, but that is what is actually the fact of the matter. That is where this debate has to take place. They have to contend with that. But secondly, on media, even more importantly than discourse, media is likely to be very opposed to angry political movements. Why is that the case? To be able to get the support of moderates, you need the support of the centrist media, because that is the kind of media that they are going to be read. But ultimately, centrist moderate media is not going to paint an angry movement in a good light. That is because they are just more inclined to support things like the status quo, more inclined as wealthy business owners, wealthy newspapers owners, to support things that don't seem as if they're going to disrupt the status quo in any massive amount. That looks like anger. I don't think as a moderate middle American individual, I'm going to support something like that. And that means at their best, you probably don't get moderate support, which means you don't have a significant amount of critical mass. To put pressure on governments, to put pressure on your oppressors to change anything. But panel, this is way too charitable. They probably get significant amounts of violence on their side of the house, magnifying all of those harms. Why is that true?
Before that,
firstly, anger makes violence reasonable. And that is because when your rhetoric becomes very, very heated, the actions of your followers are also very likely to become heated. Because although it is not direct, although it is not explicit, when you give angry rhetoric, your followers are going to interpret that anger and act on it in a physical way. Because as a follower of a movement, you don't have a platform where you can speak up. But you sure as hell can move a shop. You sure as hell can punch a policeman. That is entirely true. Secondly, you provoke violence from those who are opposed to you. This is in direct response to the POI we asked Pakistan. Because those who are opposed to you want to maintain the status quo. The police force, the government that is in power want to maintain the status quo. And what's really important about this is when you provoke violence from those individuals, they have an asymmetry on power. They have links in the media. It becomes significantly easier for them to make themselves look like the good guys, even when they commit violent acts against you. They can still paint you as the angry, violent group that needed to be oppressed. That's something they can still do. But crucially, you probably make any moderates that wanted to be involved in your movement scared of joining your movement because they're scared of violence happening to them as well. What does that mean for their case panel? It means that even if you probably get significantly less support because you're probably viewed as significantly more radical. But secondly, everyone gets associated with that anger. Everyone gets associated with that. That looks like things like the Arab Spring, which began as a democracy movement, But after looting weeks into the Arab Spring, the entire movement was painted as something that was dangerous, something that was diametrically opposed to the status quo, something that has led to civil war, something that has led to violent backlash from governments. Thirdly, then, you can never disavow that violence. Once your movement becomes violent, you cannot get rid of it, which means these movements are painted with that brush forever. Secondly, the outcomes they create, even if they get changed, are so bad they still lose this debate before that POI.
Martin Luther King led extremely violent riots, and Mandela was arrested for his protest. What were your examples of effective protests again?
Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers are two distinct groups. I think Martin Luther King could have achieved very, very meaningful change without the existence of the Black Panthers. He probably could have done it a lot quicker because LBJ wouldn't be so scared of engaging with Martin Luther King in the first place. That's an example for us. Why are their outcomes extremely bad? A few reasons. Firstly, your goals will be exclusionary. Why is that true? Because to anger people, you need to have a villain that they can direct that anger at. And that means the people who are oppressed, probably the sons or the grandsons of people who are oppressed, who actually were not involved in this anger, get the brunt of it. They probably get their land taken off them when you have things like land reparations, when you have an angry movement. That does not deserve, they don't deserve that. Secondly, even if your goals are good, when you get into power, because you were angry, because you had extreme goals, that means your followers now probably have extreme demands. They have uniquely high expectations of you, which means it becomes very difficult for you to actually maintain support. That looks like the People's Action Party in Singapore losing after their first election because their goals and their followers were so extreme. Thirdly, you create a culture of violence and resentment. That is because when you use anger and violence, as we've proven, to achieve the goals of your movement, it becomes very difficult to get rid of those things. You see maybe small amounts of violence as something acceptable in society to qualm problems. That looks like Lyra McKee being murdered by the IRA in Northern Ireland. That looks like segregated estates in Northern Ireland to prevent people throwing Molotov cocktails over the wall. That's something they have to contend with. So what actually happens then in this debate is that on their side of the house, you probably have cycles of oppression, you probably have very sloppy reform, and you probably have society becoming unlivable. Although we definitely can concede that it might take a little bit more time for our social movements to be acceptable, to be successful, I think a slightly slower, slightly more moderate social movement that garners massive amounts of moderate support and leads to good outcomes is significantly better than one that doesn't.
Thank you very much for that speech. We will now have the second prop up to continue the prop case. Here.
Am I audible? All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this is Team Opposition's case. For the past 200 years, people and African Americans have been treated as slave owners. Their voices have been neglected and they've been treated as property. Same case for women who have not even been given the right to vote until 1910 in London. And these people have been marginally oppressed systematically and been never given a voice. And Team Opposition wants us to be upset as if they had hurt our feelings, as if they had stolen our lunch money, ladies and gentlemen. Is that the kind of narrative you want to propagate in a social movement? That if you want to join us, simply support our movement because they offended us 200 years ago, because we're kind of upset and we don't want to be radical. Imagine the kind of world that Team Opposition is portraying. A world where nobody cares because it's not a really big deal anyway, because you're simply upset. The argumentation literally is, in which model are people more likely to care? In which model are people more likely to do something for the movement itself? A model where you tell them it's not a big deal. You shouldn't be angry. In fact, you're wrong for being angry, but rather you should just be simply upset and minorly, depressed. We don't think that kind of movement will ever be successful. We don't think that kind of movement will ever have systematic support and consistent support. We don't think you're ever going to have systematic change, because the only time women were given the right to vote in UK was when they stormed the parliament in 1910, because they had enough of the government's bogus continuously telling them that we're going to neglect you because the asymmetry of power exists. Notice how in team opposition model, asymmetry of power already does exist. The government is already in power. MLK would have been jailed regardless. But in which model are people more likely to care? A model where people say that, look, Nelson Mandela went to jail to support you or fight for you, and hence you owe it to him to come out on the street and do something good for the society, or a model where people simply don't care because they're simply upset. We say our form of anger looks like MLK saying that, look, we need to fight for our freedom. We owe it to the people to fight for our freedom. It looks like Greta Thunberg coming out and saying to the people that how dare they neglect things like climate change? How dare they put the life of millions and billions of people at stake? This is the kind of anger we're trying to support, and this is the kind of anger we want to have. But please notice, before I move on to anything, all of their argumentation was premised around one monolithic conception of anger and straw-manning our case. Let's break down that monolith and let's prove to you how anger is still beneficial in our model as well. A couple of responses. Number one, I say that people react to anger differently. And this is where the context of these supporters is very, very important. Because we say people who are supporters of the feminist movement or the climate change movement or the Black Lives Matter movement are genuinely people who believe in human rights, and they're not violent people like right-wing oppressors or right-wing populists to begin with. That is to say that even when they are angry, their response to anger is not to be violent, but rather do something that's good for the movement. But number two, I said they already have self-interest. The instant they know that being angry and starting killing people left, right, and center will automatically mean less support for the movement, they're unlikely to do so because they realize it's better off. But notice in which case do we support the kind of violence? We support violence when the media, when police officers literally throw tear gas at you, when the government literally tries to lock you out of parliament because they don't want to hear your concerns. This is the kind of violence that we do support. Violence that in self-defense actively causes the government to make about change. Because the asymmetry of power does exist, then notice how these people are unlikely to be heard. Their demands are unlikely to be ever voiced because the government has no incentive to do so. Team opposition had to prove to you how even through non-violent means change has come about. Historically speaking, it has never come about through non-violent means, and this is the only way we can do so. Because the Black Lives Matter movement or the feminist movement did not come about yesterday, ladies and gentlemen. It's been going on for decades, and we still have not seen tangible change. The second idea, that on principle, and notice how this is a huge strawman. Because we told you at first proposition that the biggest form of oppression oftentimes people face was that of silence. Their voice was not as important because they were slaves or because they were in inferior gender. That is why we feel the responsibility of a social movement is to not only have tangible change, but also reclaim the injustice that happened to them. And this injustice is not consequential based on whether or not the government changes for you, but the right that you had to voice your own opinion and the right that you had to be angry and tell people that what was done was wrong. That is to say the principle of reclaiming their voice and the principle of giving back the emotion that was lost for them is a benefit in and of itself and it's independent of any practical outcome. Before I move on, your smartest speaker.
Well, okay. So our smartest speaker would like to ask, Team Pakistan claimed that people will act in their self-interest and also that people react differently to anger. Are you claiming anger is a rational emotion? And if you acknowledge people react differently, aren't some people going to be irrational and violent?
I'm angry at you for bringing a really bad case. Does that mean I start punching you? I don't think so. Just because I'm angry does not necessarily mean that I have to react in terms of physical violence. This could also mean little people donating more or coming out to more protests because they realize that injustice has been done. I think your opposition is an injustice to all people who are like racially oppressed, but I'm still not angry at you in the sense I'm trying to punch at you. I'm angry at you by trying to refute your case that was so blasphemous and really, really problematic. I don't buy the characterization at all. I think human beings are much, much more rational as to where they would have them believe. But number two, I say the entire idea of how moderate support is likely to be lost. And this is very, very funny. Because number one, if we consider the idea that asymmetry of power exists, that automatically means that right-wing supporters are still likely to defame you or blaspheme you in any way whatsoever. That is to say that Fox News will still say that people demanding or having peaceful protests will still exist. Case in point, how Trump literally tear gas a peaceful protest happening in Parliament just to go visit the church. So we don't think that's exclusive in our model. Number two, I say there are already counter narratives that exist. Things like social media, things like the left-wing like media houses, like the BBC or CNN, all of those things. That automatically mean that you already do have counter narratives to support this angry movement or support these people who are coming out and protesting and doing all of those things for them. Number three, we say that even if this is violent, it is still better off because it puts people in a better position to fight back their pressures, to fight back the things that were happening to them, and tell people that, look, what was done was wrong. In your best case scenario, people who are simply upset are likely to disperse once police forces come in or once riot machines come in, and that is when you're unlikely to have tangible impact or tangible change, because the government can simply do away with you as easily as they want to do so. Having said that, in my positive case, I'll give you another impact as to how we're going to have greater accountability in our model, both in governmental institutions and in corporation institutions. But before that, crucially note that change does not necessarily have to come through large-scale national corporations. Even small local council change is a huge impact. Case in point, how the local council of Minnesota was one of the first states to actively defund the police following the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's death. That automatically means that their scale of change is too massive and a burden that we do not have to support. Even localized small change is enough for us that would likely to have better off impact. But number two, I say, then the vast majority of cases, discourse is likely to be more skewed in a world where you're having moderate response. We think it's okay for them to say that, look, we want reclamation simply because our land was taken away from us as Red Indians when these black people came in, and we think it's a very legitimate form of protest. Number two, I say, in the vast majority of cases, corporations generally have an incentive to ride the wave of popularity and do whatever is best for them. We think they do very little and have a lot of change come about. Case in point, how Apple might have a rainbow logo, but we still have child labor in China. Case in point, how Gillette might have like a thing like, what's best for men, or be the best man you can be, to like support a more feminist kind of man, but still have gender wage gap amongst their institutions. Case in point, how Harvard and Oxford still have Confederate and slave owner statues within their own institutions. We say even when they have small change, people are likely to forgive them or not hold them accountable simply because they're upset in your model. Hence, even small tokenistic policies are enough for them. We hold them under a greater lens of scrutiny and a greater lens of accountability. That is to say, we want them to bring about more long-term change. We want them to do away with gender wage gap. That automatically means that they are more likely to be boycotted. The demands are more likely to be unheard in a model where they're simply doing small-term tokenistic benefits. That puts corporations on a greater pedestal to do more, institutions should do more, because that is the level of accountability we're gonna hold them to. So on accountability itself, we're having more long-term and small-term change. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We will now have the second opposition speaker up to continue the case for Op. Here.
Might be heard.
Camera, mic on.
Honourable Chair, educators, ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King didn't stand up and say, I am in a nightmare, that we have all been living in a nightmare for the past 200 years. No. He stood up and said, I have a dream. Team Ireland stands for hope, not anger, for love, not hate. That is the comparative in this debate, because the point at which your rhetoric is defined by historical injustice, as they themselves define it as, you don't look towards the future, you look towards the past, you don't find genuine solutions to oppression. Three things in this speech. Firstly, going over the debate so far in responses. Secondly, weighing it up. And thirdly, bringing in our new substantive. So, in terms of the debate so far, firstly, they bring this idea in their case, number one, of this idea of garnering support. The key part of this here is that there's apathetic people in society who aren't already on your side. And that stark, passionate language mobilizes these previously apathetic people. We would say three things in response to this. First of all, we think it's insulting to think that oppressed people can only have impassionate, strong rhetoric when they claim a sense of anger. We think we turn to people like MLK, to people like Gandhi, and it's just demonstrably not true and insulting. Secondly, we would say apathetic people are likely people who are uninformed. And anger, in order to be palatable, needs to be seen as justified. If you're an apathetic person who isn't informed on the issues of systemic injustice and how it works, when you see people getting angry about it, you can't naturally relate to that anger because to you, it doesn't seem justified immediately. It's impalatable and your first reaction. Thirdly, we say it attacks those who are apathetic. It critiques you. You are holding up the system by not tearing it down with us. You are part of our oppression. You are evil. Now, they will say this is a powerful message. We say no one wants to know that. No one wants to accept that they are evil. You are naturally going to become defensive. You need to think, oh no, they must be radical. And when you literally are saying yourselves you will have more radical language, it's far easier for them to get away with that excuse, to tell themselves, I don't need to help them, they're just radical. They never get these key bystanders on their side. Then, on their principle, we just want to point out they completely dropped it in that second speech. It has fallen. After that, they do, in their second speech, they do this idea of power asymmetry. I'll talk about the violence aspect of that later on in another aspect of the debate so far. But in terms of the rhetoric and support, we tell you in our first speech, and this wasn't responded to, they just completely brushed over it, and then their third point is undermined by it, that this is a two-way street. When you increase anger, so does the other side. If there is this asymmetry in terms of that power, not in terms of violence, but in terms of support, in terms of funding, that is, when you make that divisive, you make it a competition. You make it a battle. When you're at a significant disadvantage, that is worse on your side of the house. We bring both parties to the table and meet in the middle. Thirdly, then, on their idea of quality. They tell you, first of all, that hardcore activists will go out and protest for longer. First of all, we think that's insulting. These are people who care about these issues. That's just completely preposterous and insulting. And secondly, we would point out it has a toll on a person. Anger is extremely stressful. It's extremely it takes a huge toll on the human being. It's not sustainable in the same way that hope is. You're not fighting for a unifying goal. You're critiquing constantly. It drains down. You live in a No, thank you. Secondly, they say that others aren't performative. We would point out that the example they try to throw out throughout their case is actually a clear example for when you are targeted as a possible oppressor, you have this immediate reaction to be performative, and that is it. You want to tick the box to abscond reality. That is the case. People sharing, you're barking at this stage, and people sharing BLM, Instagram stories left, right, and center, but not actually signing up and not actually fighting for the cause. Thirdly, they say that violence garners support. We say when that is only true when it is optically justified. When they tell you that people will react to messaging, that is a concession that as soon as you include angry rhetoric, there will be violence on their side of the house. They've conceded that. That means that this violence it's not a symbol of oppression when these protests are clashed down on. No, it's a symbol of law and order. You lose that powerful idea of garnering that support. You lose that principle of satyagraha. Fourthly, then, they say there's no alternative. We say that's just simply not true. People like Martin Luther King, we point to things like civil disobedience, boycotts, strikes, take down the system without crumbling it all down and leaving yourself under the rubble. So then in the meta aspect of this debate, weighing up, we say, even if we ignore everything I just said, even if they get more support, it doesn't matter because they haven't responded to our second point. They don't contest with the idea that the quality, the outcomes of that support is useless on their side of the house. They simply don't systemic change, and this will be even furthered with our third point, which I'm moving on to now. The thesis here is that anger and social creates, actually I'll take you.
In the status quo, conservative governments already use violence to disperse peaceful protests. What would your docile participants do in that instance?
Yeah, and as I just said, if you were listening, you will hear that when that is seen as justified, when you have violent wings in that protest, it is not seen as a system of oppression. When peaceful protesters are cracked down on, when there is no clear optical justification for that, it is seen as a symbol of that oppression. You don't get that on your side of the house, we do. So yeah, the thesis of this statement is that anger in social movements creates a culture which is oppositional and non-conducive to cohesive social change. What does this anger look like? Firstly, we say there's no moral minimum. And this is extremely important because there's a ceiling for palatable discourse in any society. This, though, that when there's no moral minimum, you have to be absolute. It pushes everyone past that. It tells you you're not angry enough, you need to do more. Secondly, we'll say it's not contained. You can't switch it off. People react differently. You've no idea what you're pushing out there. You have no idea what your movement is going to turn into. What then are the outcomes of this? Three things. First of all, we would say it's self-cannibalizing. This is because when they tell us in their quality point that soft activists are encouraged to do more, that's them being told you're not angry enough. You're sympathizing. You're an Uncle Tom. It's also, secondly, it creates this demeanor of absolutes. It socializes you to rush to conclusions. Everything is wrong. Everything is a historic injustice. This means you don't empathize. It means black police officers are targeted. It leads to things like cancel culture. This means, firstly, that you don't get the support of those soft activists and those people who you will be self-cannibalizing. And secondly, you are creating more oppression, the quality of outcomes is gone. B, the absence of empathy. The thing here is that when you approach discussion from absolutes, from this idea of righteous anger, those are absolute presuppositions. This means you're not looking for minds change. You're not looking for a genuine discussion. Instead, your reactionary original position is entrenched. Not only does that mean you won't probably get change because you're not going to meet in the middle at all, you're not going to get quality change which actually solves the problems, it also means that reactionary position may just be wrong. It may be Black Panthers looking to separate from the United States. It's never feasible, and it probably isn't even a good idea in the first place, but it's locked in place for that aspect of the movement. But on their side of the house, that is every aspect of the movement. They have to do this actively across these movements. You're well out of time. C, on the idea of righteous anger, because the fact is that this is exclusionary in nature. It creates an oppression Olympics. When you say we are the most harmed in society, you are discounting, you are undermining the harm and the oppression that is placed on other people in that society. This means, one, that when this is true, it means bystanders are pushed away because you're telling them you can't have your own harms. Even if that is justified to say that, it is naturally oppositional, it pushes people away. Two, when it's in the gray, when it's not clearly true, it prevents a united movement. This looks like working class voters who are white in America voting Republican, and they don't get the systemic change they claim from their side of the house. You just get 1 or 2 police officers arrested, never prouder to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now welcome back the third prop to include the substantive proportion of the prop case. Here.
यार इधर आ जाना मैं ये सेटअप करके बस ये टाइम किसी पे नई बात किया है मैंने से की बात करनी यार बाय सेमेस्टर की बात ट्रेनिंग में करते हैं हां सर ये मैं टाइम बताता हूं Both sides have, by this point, conceded that minorities are the most important stakeholder in this debate. This is to say, when 80% of their case is about where there is more support for minorities, shows that they're willing to concede that. Insofar as that is true, their argumentation about you might just have extreme reparation, like taking away land from descendants of slavery, is just not as important in this debate. We say it's fine. It's not extreme reparation, it's adequate reparation. I find it funny that sitting in Ireland, they cannot relate to problems of people who went through colonization or race inequality. We'd be fine with giving their land back to them. Given that minorities are the most important stakeholder, let's show you why we then win this debate. Firstly, on the principle and why this affects a particular type of minority. We say when you were oppressing these minorities, silence was the tool that you used the most. Whenever they spoke back, you called them degenerates. You took their voice away from them. We say, given that this is the context of historical oppression, regardless of consequences, the most important impact that we bring to you on moral grounds is that you want me to stop? 1 minute. Is that you give them that voice back, you allow them to speak up, you tell them that's not okay for you to stay silent, it's okay for you to speak up. This is not contingent on what the reaction to you speaking up is. This is simply contingent on what the movement should do given the historical context that has occurred. We say these are the sort of sub-stakeholder within minorities that deserve the most amount of attention in this debate. Their response is, well, not everyone is angry. We say this is just a symmetrical argumentation. If not everyone is angry, not everyone is upset. Like the people that they want to be upset might just be feeling angry. But secondly, we say it's about making the most number of emotions accessible to your minorities. Insofar as people who want to be upset are concerned, they can already be upset in the status quo. But people who want to be angry, those are the ones whose voices have been taken away. Therefore, as a social movement, crucially, the responsibility on you lies to cater to those people and make this emotion accessible to them. And if not accessible to them, then be the voice for them. If they cannot be angry, you voice their anger. We then say this principle is most important in the debate for 2 crucial reasons. A, This idea of people being upset is inexclusive. You can have under that R model versus this exclusive benefit of you now being able to voice out in an angry manner. Secondly, we say this is more important because there is a certain impact. Given this contingent on you just being angry and not the reaction of what that anger is, this impact outflows the moment you take up our policy. Their harms are contingent on how people react, which is debatable. It is a potential harm. So it's a certain principle moral argument that deals with the most important stakeholder. We're already winning this debate because we're giving the voice back to people. On to support now. Over here, let's just look at the framing of the world that they've given to you before I talk to you about why support is better. They say the world is really, really bad. There's asymmetry of power. Media is against you. Politicians are against you. Firstly, I reject this framing. Why? These say there'll always be news organizations like CNN, etc. for two main reasons. A, there are always different ideological leanings. So if you have Fox News, you'll also have owner of CNN News who want to actually be liberal. Secondly, we say you just have an incentive to gain the most amount of viewers. Insofar as you want most amount of viewers, you want to give the most diverse amount of content. Secondly, we say their own example of Arab Spring, etc. shows that the world is not just completely asymmetrical like they pointed out to be. We say the framing of the world now is such that people are willing to listen to you, but you need to bring institutional change. And for that, you need more impetus for change. You need more anger. Lastly, I want to point out, even if I concede to their framing of the debate as the world being so bad, it equally harms their argumentation. Because if the world is so bad, love and hope alone is not going to bring any change. The second crucial framing is then of anger. They say, anger necessarily leads to violence. Here are three things that they've conceded to that are also a result of anger that are not violence. A, just more protests, i.e. going and sitting outside White House and shouting names to Trump, saying that we demand change. Secondly, songs like F the Police. These are songs that are made in disobedience to show your anger. Thirdly, civil disobedience. Civil disobedience does not happen when you're just upset. Civil disobedience happens when you're angry at the structures of the state and you do not want to follow them anymore. This crucially shows to you that there's so many other outcomes of anger that are just as effective. But also note crucially that this is not just anger on the past. This is anger that says you owe it to us to give us reparations. Therefore, it is focusing on the future. It is demanding change. They cannot misconstrue that. That said, we say these are all benefits they have not engaged with because they never came onto our ground. They just harp on about violence. But given all of these outcomes are exclusive to anger because love does not lead to civil disobedience. But even if there's some violence in our model, we say this is likely to be started by the oppressor. Why is this the case? The framing of people who support social movements is such that they care a lot about civil rights, they care about humanity, they care about not hurting innocent people. Insofar as that is true, even when they're angry, their anger is directed towards the oppressor, and they're not just gonna kill bystanders or punch bystanders for that matter. They're gonna, stay away from that. The second reason for why this is true is because they're aware of the causes, interest of their cause. They know the harms of just killing random people, not likely to happen. Why then do we have more support? The only reason they've given you for lack of support is that you're gonna be portrayed out to be an extreme movement and moderate supporters will go away. You being portrayed out to be extreme is not contingent on what you as a movement are, but rather contingent on how people misconstrue you out to be. Insofar as that is true, it happens in either world because there are organizations and politicians who have an incentive to do so. Trump does not do this because he actually thinks you're extreme. He does this because it brings him voters. The Fox News does this because of ideology. Men might do it because they want to keep their power. We said at that point, this idea of misconstruing you out to be extreme will exist even in their world, even when you're just not being angry and just being docile. We say the impact of them is you always have to tread a careful line where you have to be docile and bow down to the system. We say then it becomes an inexclusive harm. Why do we say are we better then? Because we on our side reject that this is a fair criticism. We accept being extreme, we accept being angry, and we justify being angry. Insofar as you continue to go away from the anger and keep bowing down to the system, you'll never be able to demand things that go in line with that anger. I.e., adequate reparation will not happen in their model. Even if you have more supporters, it will be token benefits that we're not okay with. Secondly, we say people just have more access to information now. They won't just buy that these people were violent for no reasons. Like we saw in the George Floyd protest, they figured out it was the oppressors who started that violence. Insofar as that is true and access information to is greater, we say anger is something that brings tangible benefits in terms of support too. What then is the comparative in this debate? It's not enough for them to prove why they have more number of people supporting the movement. They have to go the extra step and show why that leads to effective change. Their examples of MLK, etc., show that you are put in jail anyways and you needed violence. The examples of Arab Spring shows that change not only came when you had number of supporters, but when you were willing to burn yourself and upload that picture on media to get that support. That is sort of commitment that we only have under our side. Why is this commitment far more important than anything else in this debate? Social movements to bring change need to be disruptive. They require a compromise. So even if there are more number of people on their side, but they're not willing to compromise enough or make that sort of commitment, we don't think they'll be able to bring tangible change. Structures and politics and laws, etc. Shajil's argument about how you have more accountability and you have more impetus to change only happens when you have anger. Even if there is violence, that violence leads to more support. They have the burden to showing to us why without that violence, without that anger, without Arab Spring, why they would have been able to get any support and how they will go about it in the future. I urge you to vote Pakistan.
Thank you very much for that speech. We will now have the third op-up to conclude the standard portion of the debate. Alexander, please make sure you mute yourself. Thank you.
Can I be heard? Am I good to go? Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen. Panel, when you are angry, are you a rational actor? Are you concerned with what is in your best interest? That's really the crux of Team Pakistan's case in the response to why this won't lead to violence. They say, oh, when I'm a looter, when I'm out to punch a cop, I'm going to have an internal reflection where I realize, is this going to be the best outcome on a macro level for my entire movement? People are individualized. They concede this in their second speech when they say people react differently to violence. That was a knife for their own case, right? They cannot control anger. They cannot patent an emotion. People decide what that means for themselves and they will act irrationally. That's why they lose this debate. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly on the process, secondly on outcomes, and lastly on culture. Let's talk about process. Let's clear up our counterfactual panel. They say, how are you going to get any change? And they say, oh, boycotts are immediately angry. Note, panel, that we gave a clear counterfactual here. We like discourse that brings people on board, that doesn't blame them for past wrongs, that paints a picture of hope for the future, which I would agree that asymmetric relationships, when you're dealing with the entrenched class and you are the oppressed, are more likely to find amenable. They're more likely to find that appealing. They're more likely to get on board with that, right? They say they provided us no counterfactual. What an assertion from Team Pakistan. We were very clear for our very first speech, and we gave you examples of such. But let's deal with their principle. They say it's the most important thing in the debate, even though their third speaker spends about 3 times as long as their first speaker. They gave it 30 seconds in their first speech, and now suddenly it's the most important thing in the debate because they realize they're losing on practicals. I'm going to take it out right here. Firstly, this principle is reliant on practicals. It's stemmed around the idea of silence and people being justified in their anger. The point at which that we prove that you're still being ignored, that you're still silent, that you don't affect change, this principle becomes a practical concern. But secondly, it is a pure assertion to say that we're excluding people who otherwise would feel angry, right? This ignores the analysis we give you in our third point. They say you can be calm and rational outside the house. No, you can't due to cancel culture. We gave you explicit analysis of this. They are innately exclusionary of the masses of people who don't want to be violent, who don't want to be angry, who don't want to live their life, having to justify their oppression to people and being all of the time. You're barracking. Stop offering 2 POIs one after another. Look, let's talk about our material, right? Because they largely just ignore it. Firstly, we tell you that anger is inherently emotive. They cannot control the nature of which people react to it. They acknowledge this in their asymmetry analysis. They say we win if people are violent because people are going to be outraged and they realize what is required to uphold the system. At the point at which you're not suppressing violent protesters, but it's an issue of law and order, that's the way the state and the asymmetric relationship they talk about can control the media in the conservative societies that they're talking about to paint paint these people as terrorists. The point at which I'm labeled a violent terrorist, I do not have a justification for the masses that they acknowledge in their first speech you're required to have on board the political capital necessary to get your movement on the ground. That was a huge concession for them, the point at which they acknowledged that you're not reliant on activists, you're reliant on voters. The point at which you alienate them, they lose this debate and they acknowledge it such. But secondly, we gave you a very compelling response in our second speech about the sustainability of their anger. The crux of their argument, right, is anger is emotive, so it's going to get people out and on the streets. Note that we tell you, right, anger is not sustainable. This is the reason why you see these posts of people withdrawing from social media in the Black Lives Matter movement because their mental health is in tatters. It's very stressful to be angry all the time. It's very stressful to be combative. The point at which you cannot have rational conversations because you exist in a diametric opposition with the people you are discussing with, that's the point at which you were maybe angry for about 3 weeks, but after that, as they acknowledge, you get performative activism. The point at which they say performative activism was a problem, they shouldn't have been propping anger because that's what leads to it. But thirdly and finally, let's finish off this clash, right? They acknowledge these are asymmetric societies, and we say that we care about minorities. We absolutely do. But the point at which you justify anger, as they say, they legitimize it, that is a two-way street. The parties in power can also use that rhetoric to humanize minorities and to label them not just as terrorists, but as moral degenerates. Social movements can be applicable to conservative societies as well. They cannot define social movements as just minorities. They apply across the spectrum, and they will utilize the rhetoric and the tools.
Point of information.
Right. At the conclusion of this question, right, panel, you might not be sure who wins this debate because there's kind of ships crossing in the night and you're not sure who to weigh up. This is where the second question becomes very important. Well, I've painted a path to victory in terms of how we can get change, but let's look at outcomes. They gave a 30-second response to our second point in their intro. They are behind in this debate, and I'm going to tell you why you should weigh this clash very heavily. The reason why you should weigh this clash, right, is firstly because we're not saying that land reparations are extreme and you shouldn't get, reparations. The acknowledgement we have, right, is that when you become the oppressor, when you turn the tables in your side, and the side actually stands better on our side. But secondly, right, we tell you the point at which you need to be sustainable once you get that change. That change can't be overturned because you've created a culture of violence and resentment in which your life is unlivable for that minority. That's the reason why, if you don't buy the first clash, you're not sure who to go with, you should go with us because we actually dealt with this clash. They gave a 30-second glib response in an intro. We tell you three things, right? Firstly, that your goals are likely to be
before that.
You said that this is just taking land off people. No, this looks like Robert Mugabe killing farmers in Rhodesia before it was Zimbabwe and kicking them off their land because he had to be oppositional, because he had to rely on angry rhetoric, right? On our side of the house, we think this becomes a policy discussion where you get equal reparations, take into account the needs of the people who are descendants of oppressors, absolutely, but had nothing to do with that oppression. The point at which you have to exclude those people, you get the violent bush war that you had in Rhodesia, but you also get an established class within that minority who controls all the power because they had a sloppy implementation of the outcomes they want to talk about. Secondly, right, we tell you that even if their goals are good, they're likely to be quite expedient for the reasons they say. That anger is quick, it gets people moving, it wants you out of your seat. The point at which this becomes right? I don't want them to be expedient. I want them to think their decisions through. I want them to realize the ramifications this can not only have on the minority person, but also to society as large, and how it can wreck my country. But thirdly and finally, right, we got absolutely no response for the culture of anger, resentment, and hatred that they can create on their side of the house. We tell you about Northern Ireland. Sure, you might have a peace process. You might have parity sharing. But the point at which I have to hide behind a wall because someone's going to throw a Molotov cocktail into my housing estate because they hate me so much, because of the type of rhetoric that they're talking about, that they have no control over, that has to be oppositional, that has to paint a picture of in the past rather than the picture of hope. That's the point at which they lose the debate. Sure.
Just generally, do you think it's justified for a woman who was sexually assaulted by a man to be angry at men? Just very generally.
Look, this is their principled claim, right? Okay, let's take them at their best. Towards the extent that the analysis is symmetric and that would lead to worse outcomes for sexual assault survivors across the board, then sure, yes. Okay, let's deal with the last clash, right, about culture. They never respond to this. But before I move on to it, right, panel, the way up between the outcomes and the practicalities of the process is the point at which it becomes unsustainable. To the point at which you create a violent culture that means you're likely to be ousted from power, that your movement gets tainted forever, and you never get to actually implement that change long-lasting. That looks like economic freedom fighters that exist in South Africa, where they cannot have sustainable land reparations, and it leads to violence on the ground. They don't get sustainable. But on culture, right, we firstly tell you that there's a culture of moral policing on their side of the house that is directly responsive to their first point about getting activists. They're soft activists, right? They're not the most woke people. They're apathetic, as they acknowledge, to the point in which we don't have a moral minimum and everyone has to race to the bottom to be the most angry, the most combative. That doesn't just mean you get more violent, right? It also means that movement is inherently alienating to you as an ally and you're not likely to join in those protests. But secondly, right, what also doesn't go responded to, we tell you you're much less willing to compromise with people and make rational decisions and be an appealing middle ground. Team Ireland stands for the oppressed. We stand for outcomes. Never been happier to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. We now move to the reply portion of the debate where the speaking times are halved and the speaking order reversed. So I'd like to invite the opposition reply to begin the reply section. Here.
Yes.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, I think two things were very clear by the end of this debate. Firstly, both sides wanted to help minorities, wanted to ensure that their social movements were successful. But secondly, that each side had two very different ideas about what was and what wasn't a successful social movement. We said it was one that had meaningful outcomes that actually helped those people. They said it was one that garnered the most support. I think we won both of those questions, but even if you don't think we won the one that they wanted to focus on, we still win this debate. Two questions. Firstly, success in support. We told you we had two very simple claims. They probably don't get a lot of support because firstly, you distance the majority, you distance the moderates in society because you are perceived as angry by the media, you're perceived as angry with your discourse. But secondly, what's more likely is that you probably become a violent movement and have even less support. Panel, for us to win this clash, we only needed to win one of those two things. That is important. Their responses were a fewfold. Firstly, they said, we still get support. Why was that? The only response they really had that was meaningful, that stood up in this debate, was that left-wing media exists, that people are going to read sources like left-wing media houses, and that's going to convince them that these protest movements are worthwhile supporting. Look, I think we made it very clear that if you're someone on the left, you're probably already in this protest movement, you're probably already in this social movement. The people we needed to attract were middle America. We're middle-class people who could actually support them because they had the political capital to vote out the people who had been oppressing them. I don't think that if I'm someone who reads Breitbart, I'm going to be convinced by these things because I'm not watching CNN, right? I'm not watching left-wing media sources. We told you that. I'm reading newspapers that are of a centrist viewpoint. And at that point, it is at that point that the difference between a law and order crackdown on angry, violent protesters and a protest movement seeking to achieve political change becomes the crucial distinction. We were on that side, they were on this side. They were always the one that centrists never supported. But secondly, they told us that even if you don't get as much support, because you're angry, you can achieve more meaningful change. Hannah, I think we also made it very clear that if I'm an angry, violent protester, I'm probably much more likely to be arrested than a non-angry, non-violent protester. I'm significantly more likely to be cracked down. They conceded this themselves. I think they lost that question as well. So basically what happens then is that even if we don't get violence, they still don't get support. But we said you got violence. We made it very clear violence is an abstract emotion that you cannot understand. If one or two people react violently, that movement gets painted as violent. And what that means is that they probably didn't get the moderate support they wanted. And what that means is that moderates didn't use their political capital to vote out the politicians that had been oppressing them. I think our counterfactual was very, very clear. The only thing that wasn't clear, the only thing that they had in this debate was their clash about media. I think I just made it very clear that media was irrelevant. But panel, even if you think they won this clash, the way more important clash in this debate was the clash on outcomes. Because the social movement ultimately is in no way successful if you don't achieve meaningful outcomes for those people. This was why we won the debate entirely. The context of this matters because minorities, to be in any way successful, to in any way achieve any meaningful change, need some kind of actual change. Need to feel like they were affected by that change. Why did we get this? Because their failed social movements that are violent, that are angry, probably don't get that kind of change because it fosters a culture of violence in that society. It allows that violence to breed. We didn't get those things because we had a movement that was constructive. Crucially, we had a movement that included the people who oppressed them in the past. We had a movement that allowed those those people to support them, that allow those people not to feel oppressed. And because we have those things, panel, I think we got significantly better outcomes. Panel, I want you to weigh this up in your head. On their side of the house, at best, you've got 200 more people at a protest, or you've got an extra brick through a window. I think that might be good for their side of the house because they've got slightly more support. But when you compare that to taking the people who were the sons and daughters of the oppressors onto your side of the movement and having them engaged with that peace process, allowing for us to achieve any sort of meaningful outcome, I think we took this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to conclude the debate, we'll welcome the proposition reply. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The only thing that team opposition has done throughout this debate is engage with our worst case throughout. The only ground that ever tried to attack is our worst grounds, in which people always react to anger in a violent manner. But please also notice that in this characterization, they only asserted that people act in a violent manner. We give you such structured reasons as to why we think that the reaction is likely to be diverse and is likely to be unviolent because it is not in the best interest of the people who are human rights activists, and it's not in the best interest of the movement itself, which will be seen or portrayed as inherently evil. No systematic responses there whatsoever. But notice a huge inconsistency at third opposition, and this cements our case, where they said, look, at one hand, they're saying that you're unlikely to have any change simply because the people are likely to not support you anymore because you're too extreme. At the same time, they give the example of Robert Mugabe, who had extreme change, right? Who was literally going to go miles away from what the norm is simply to bring about change because they're angry. So which one is it? Are they for no change via anger, or are they for extreme change? We at Proposition told you that reasonably speaking, the change is somewhere likely to be in between. The way it was in MLK's program, the way it was in the Arab Spring, the way it was in the suffragette movement, the way it was in the French Revolutionary movement, all of these examples that we give analysis for, right? Because even if you were to concede, then the vast majority of cases, all countries call you degenerates because, well, you're fighting for greater rights that illiberal countries don't want to give you, i.e. in the case of in the case of the Arab Spring, you automatically are already going to be called out. Why is then this embracement of anger better off? Because if your fear is being too extreme, then the only thing you're going to get is more tokenistic benefits, i.e. women being given the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, but not enough legal representation at all. That automatically means at best, your change at opposition is A, marginal, and B, not going to come about because people don't really care about being upset about love and hope as a whole. That's number one. But number two, we said the counterfactual is then better off. Because the instant people make riots, the instant people protest more actively, more aggressively, that automatically means that the issue comes into the light. People are now more concerned as to why they're being angry, as to what is happening. This automatically means that more information goes to the moderates via other channels, which automatically means they're more likely to respond. To which they said, oh well, but people are going to go to jail. That means you're already conceding that the country itself is extremely racist and extremely patriarchal, which means that no effective change is going to come through your own peaceful protest. But if that is the case, we create more moral panic through that model as well, i.e. telling people that, oh, look, how bad the government is, how explicitly oppressive the government is by putting people who protested for you, by putting people who fought for your rights in jail. That automatically means that our form of anger is likely to be sustained when the demands of the people are not being met, because we become even more pissed off by the fact that we're going to jail and our voices are still not being heard. On a comparative then, notice how they had no engagement to our non-violent arguments of how people are more likely to protest in and of itself, how people are likely to go there and simply donate more to the cause. People are likely to engage more with people who are extremists. People are likely to just give more or research more into the concept as a whole. That automatically means that on a comparative, they had no engagement with our best case and only attacked our practicals on the worst case they could possibly imagine, and that's even worse off. And this is where I get to the most crucial argumentation that we gave you at Proposition, where we said that, look, even if I were to concede that being angry has absolutely no tangible benefits, no change comes about in our worst case scenario. Why do we still think it's important? Because we told you from the very get-go that in the vast majority of cases, oppression came through silence. It came to the idea that if you are weak, if you are inferior, you do not have the right to vote, do not have the right to speak, do not have the right to move your body the way you want it to be moved. That means that in proper opposition's case, the women who were raped in third world countries, the African Americans who were treated as slaves, even in the modern world, are not told to be angry. They're not told to act out and lash out and come on the streets and shout their lungs out because they deserve to do that, because they have been oppressed and they've been violated. The only thing you tell them, oh, just be upset and believe in love and hope. Is that the kind of world you want to live in? We are very proud to do this.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. Congratulations on a fantastic debate. We obviously can't cross the floor and shake hands, so a hearty virtual high five or something will have to suffice instead. Everyone please wait in the room. We'll be back with you in the near future with a result. Judges, I'll message the chat now to get us moved.
Thanks, Team Pakistan. Great debate.
Thank you, Ireland. It was a great debate.
Year after
Rob,
year,
can you also just
the
put
World's
your email
Course Debating
into the chat so
Championship
we can email you the
gathers the
ballot?
best debaters from
Yep, will
around the
do.
globe. This year's
I'll
pandemic
chuck it in. We can
made
move to
that
the breakout
impossible,
room.
so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate.